All right. Good morning, everyone. Everybody doing well? Had a good week? Supposed to be warm first couple of days, and then going to turn off a little cool Wednesday. Now, let me tell you, weathermen cannot predict the future. We know that. Cannot predict weather. We know that. But be careful who you listen to. I listened to two different weathermen out of Nashville this morning. One of them said that the rain's coming Wednesday. We'll be out of here after lunch, be finished. The second one said it's coming, and after lunch there will be snow flurries on Wednesday. One of them is badly mistaken. We'll find out which one. Well, to be honest, one was a man and one was a woman. One was a woman. So I tell you what, most of the weather people in Nashville now are women, if you look at it. Count it all up, which is fine. All right. We want to add one to, I have one to add to the sick list, the prayer list, or I guess maybe it's probably an even better way of saying it. Sandra Ferguson. This is a neighbor of the Chesters. This lady is very sick. She's in Vanderbilt Hospital, and they don't know exactly what's wrong with her. She's been there 9 days, so you know she's got to be sick because insurance won't let you stay that long. But do remember Sandra Ferguson in your prayers. Are there others that we need to mention? All right. Well, do be mindful of Miss Lily Hubble's family. Funeral was yesterday. And others that are on the sick list, prayer list as well. Went to see Jim Moss Thursday. And Jim is in the village. And what did I say? Demos. I'm sorry. Am I at Bellevue Church of Christ? You know. Yeah, well, keep me straight. Jim DeMoss. Jim is doing fairly well. And he's taking nourishment real well. And you get opportunity to go see him, go see him. Just go in the village, go in the door, elevator's right there. Go up one floor, bear to the right. He's first room. If he's not the first, he's the second room on the right. And spend 5 or 10 minutes with him. I'm sure he'd appreciate that. All right, if you'd have your Bibles, turn to the book of Exodus. We're looking at questions in the Bible. And today we're going to look at one that's found actually in the 4th chapter, but I want us to start in the 1st chapter, if you will. Kind of get a great flow for the context. Let me ask you a question. Has anyone ever given you something, or has anyone ever told you that I want to entrust you with something, and when I come back, whenever that is, I want it back? Or if something happens to me, I want to entrust you with whatever it is. You ever had that happen to you? Back, Ethan was little. So probably, let's see, it would have probably been around 1993, 94, somewhere in that neighborhood. Suzanne and I decided we needed a will. And there were specific reasons why we needed a will. But one in particular was who would take care of Ethan if something happened to both of us. And so we had a lawyer friend who was a deacon of the church draw up our will. And so before we actually went to him and had them drawn up, we went to my brother-in-law and sister. And we said, if something happens to both of us, we're sorry. But would you take Ethan? Absolutely. No problems. And so about a year or so later, Carol calls me up one day. We're fixing to have wills drawn up. Okay. Would you take our girls? No. Yes, of course. We'd be glad to. We'd be honored to. Prayed real hard Carol and Vernon would live. And they did. Thankfully, girls are grown now and have their own children. I got to see one of them this past week, so that's good. But you've probably had something similar. Have you ever been entrusted with literally something? And when you've been entrusted with it, you've said, okay, here it is. When we want it later. When we broke up Mother's house to move her in to assisted living, we went through some things. Mother was still all right at the time because she lived in independent living for 11, 12 years. And she was sitting there and she said, do you know what this is? I said, yes, ma'am. Well, what is it? And I said, well, we boys in the neighborhood, we played ball and all together. Yeah. Well, I said, one time we started a little club. And I said, we had 10-cent dues. And every week you had to pay 10 cents. And I think that must have lasted a couple of weeks because I think there was $2 or $3 in it. And I said, that's what that is. I said, I was the treasurer. She said, well, I didn't know all this, or I'd forgotten it. And I said, I was the treasurer. And the reason I was the treasurer was I was the only one they could trust. And I said, so I think I went out and bought Mama Coke with it. That's how little it was. But we still had it some 35 plus years later. We've all been entrusted with something or promised to be entrusted with something. This morning, what I want us to look at is the fact that you have been entrusted, you have been given certain things. How are you taking care of them? Let's think about that. Let's look beginning in Exodus chapter 1. In Exodus chapter 1, we began, first of all, with, if you will, the suffering of Israel. If you notice, beginning in verse 8 of the first chapter, it says, there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, you had the closing of the story of Joseph in Genesis 50, the last chapter of the book of Genesis. And we somewhat covered that in the last couple of weeks, so I'm not going to get into that. But other than the fact that here arose, as it's called in verse 8, another king. And he said to his people, this is chapter 1, verse 9, look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And it happened in the event of the war that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were in dread of the children of Israel. As the punishment got harder, as the task got more difficult, the children of Israel kept growing. The Egyptians were afraid of the Israelites. They were afraid of their numbers and afraid that they would take them over. And so you continually have this growing of problem, if you will. And ultimately, the children of Israel are crying out, we want help. We need help. We need relief. We need release from all of this. And so in Exodus chapter 2, Moses is born. And we'll not get into all of that. We know Moses is born. We know some of the early years of Moses. We know that Moses, according to verse 11 following, that he was grown. And he went out to his brethren, he looked at their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of the brethren, of course, the murder that took place. And Moses had to flee. Moses had to go and ultimately went to the land of Midian. Then you find in chapter 3, you find an interesting, if you will, commission of Moses. Moses is standing at the burning bush. That's always a fascinating story for children, where the bush is burning but it doesn't burn. That doesn't happen unless, of course, by God and a miracle. But he's told to take his shoes off, for the ground upon which he stands is holy. And notice verses 9 and 10 of this text. Well, I'll tell you what, let's go back to verse 7. The paragraph begins in verse 7. The Lord said, I've surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from the land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. Now, therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people and the children of Israel out of Egypt. And so Moses is commissioned by God. You're going to lead my children, and you're going to lead them out of bondage. And so you get to the third chapter. You finish the third chapter, and Moses hears this. He hears God's, what I call God's commission. You're going to go, here's what you're going to do, and here's how you're going to handle it. You're going to lead my children. Well, Moses, in modern day, we would say Moses is from Missouri, because Moses needs to have a little show me, and he does. Moses was young. His faith, I'm sure, was good, but how great it was at this point, we don't know. If we live our life and we watch our life and we look at our life, how it is, I don't see how our faith can do anything but grow. We read our Bible, we see the help of God, the protection of God, the safety, the security that God gives. And we see, as we look at our lives, yep. Can't say definitively that was God, but I just believe that it was. Moses was young. Maybe he hadn't had all of those experiences. He's probably had some. But yet imagine the daunting task of leading millions of people. It's not easy to place that burden upon anyone's shoulders, but God is giving it to Moses. And so Moses, he's got questions. And in the second chapter, the fourth chapter, Moses stands. Moses answered and said, suppose they will not believe me or listen to my voice. Suppose they say the Lord has not appeared to you. So the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? That's our question for the day. Now we go on and we know the story, and he said, well, it's a rod, and he said, well, cast it to the ground. And so he cast it to the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from it. Then the Lord said to Moses, reach out your hand, take it by the tail. I'm sorry, that is faith. Take it by the tail. And he reached out his hand, he caught it, and became a rod in his hand, that they may believe the Lord God of their fathers, and the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and God of Jacob has appeared to you. So God is convincing Moses, I'm going to be with you. He's already, if you noticed, if you caught it as you were probably reading along with me in the third chapter, God has proclaimed to be the great I am. And I know that's really hard for us to capture, but really in that phraseology, all God is really saying is, I'm the it. I am the complete it. And when you look at it like that, you think, oh, okay, I got it now. And that's what God has been trying to tell Moses all along. But he ultimately, this is sort of the final straw. You've heard of the straw that broke the camel's back. I had a game like that as a kid. I don't know if you did too, but it was a game where, it was a plastic camel, and you little dial, and it'd tell you how many straws, little wooden pegs you put in it, and eventually the camel's back would break, and you'd get all the straws, and you played until someone didn't have any straws left. Well, that, of course, goes back to the old saying, the straw that broke the camel's back. This time in the changing of the rod, it kind of became the straw that broke the camel's back, the convincing of Moses. Okay, I can go and I can stand before Pharaoh. An impossible task, but Moses is willing to take it on. He's convinced that God is going to help him. He's convinced, okay, God's going to be with me. And so he takes it on. It is, though, that question there in verse 2, what's in your hand, that I want us to think about this morning. What's in your hand? God always, or God not always, but God has used many times in many places, God has used little things, if you will, to make his point and to get done, to accomplish the things that he needed and wanted to accomplish. Came across a list I thought was interesting of things like that. When you think about in the Bible, you think about what we studied not long ago on Wednesday night in the book of Judges, the 3rd chapter, and Shamgar and his ox goad that he killed 600 Philistines. Basically just if you will, a long stick. It's a prick. You think about David and his slingshot that killed Goliath in 1 Samuel, the 17th chapter. You think about Jacob and his tools that dug the wells, if you will, in the book of Genesis. And you move forward to John, the 4th chapter, and you see it, Jesus talking to a lady sitting by the well. And you think, wow, here's this well that has stood the test of time, these wells, but this well where she was in John 4. And you imagine, and sometimes I don't know if you ever have, but have you ever imagined maybe sat under an old tree on a farm, family farm, and you sit under that tree and you think about all the things that old tree has seen, all the things that old tree has experienced, the kids playing around it, how many times maybe it was used for home base in a game of chase, how many little girls' pigtails were pulled up under it, how many times maybe a old swing was tied to it, how many picnics were held under it, how many young loves courted up under it, all the possibilities that might come about. Think about this well. This is one of several. Jacob dug several, but think about all that it had seen. But think about the woman there and the import of that well to her and that story to us today. With a lunch, Jesus fed 5,000. With a widow, remember she gave 2 mites, and Jesus talked about in Mark chapter 2 or chapter 12. Yes, chapter 12 talked about a great gift. Little things. Zechariah said, behold the day of small things. We often think about things, and when we think about size, numbers are important in church, but we need to look beyond the idea of numbers to the idea of souls. We can think about things from the standpoint of what's important and what's not important, what's valued and what's not valued. And sometimes we think about, okay, it's got to be big, or God doesn't value it. I can't value it. Zechariah said, no, think about the day of small things. Things that you and I maybe take for granted, things that you and I have that we often take for granted. God uses us, and he uses us in a way that's good for him and good for his will. But I want you to think about things in your life that ultimately are in your hand. And I want you to ponder that this morning. I think this is a great question for us to look at. as we think about what have I been entrusted with? I haven't been entrusted as Shamgar was with an ox goad, or David with a slingshot, or Jacob with well-digging tools. But I have been entrusted with something, some things. The equivalent of the story, really, in many ways, is the parable of talents in the New Testament. And we know the story well. Remember, called in five. One was given 5 talents. One was given 2 talents. One was given 1 talent. The master told them, take care of your talents. 5-talent man gained 5 more talents. 2-talent man gained 2 more talents. 1-talent man went and he told the master, he said, I was afraid. He was afraid of the judgment day, if you will. He was afraid that, the master eventually would come back and the master would ask him for an accounting of what he had done with his talent. But he was also afraid of the day itself. So he was afraid of the master and he was afraid of the day. And so he says, I went and I buried my talent. I hid it. And he's rebuked that you would have done something with your talent. Basically, you know the story. You should have done something with what you had. Well, it reminds us that we are to do something with what we have. Paul said the same thing in Romans chapter 12. He talks about different gifts, and he says, having gifts, therefore, use them. So what have you been entrusted with? Well, preacher, I never was entrusted with others' children, or I never was entrusted with money. I never was entrusted with this, that, or the other, but you've been entrusted with things. God has given you things. You are, after all, because we all are, we're stewards of the things God has given to us. So let's think about some of the things that is in your hand. We have the traditional list, and I'll come to some of those if I have time, but I was thinking this week, and then I got to thinking again last night and looking at this lesson and studying it again, of a couple of things especially that I thought, well, this is a little bit different than the traditional list of what's in your hand. Let's think about a couple of things that are non-traditional, and then we'll think about maybe the things that when preachers get up and preach this lesson, they talk about. Within your hand is your legacy. Have you ever thought about what your legacy is? Folks, you don't have to be a millionaire to have a legacy. All of us have a legacy. A legacy is simply put what we're going to be remembered by. Turn your Bibles to Nehemiah, the 13th chapter. Nehemiah, the 13th chapter. I love the story of Nehemiah. The story of Nehemiah is, first of all, it's a great story about leadership, and I love the subject of leadership, and I love the idea of leadership. It's the story of a man that finds out his home country, finds out Jerusalem is in disarray, and wants to go home and rebuild home. And he does that because Artaxerxes lets him. He gives him permission to go home for a while. And when Nehemiah gets there, now you got to understand that basically because of enemy actions, that Jerusalem's walls are destroyed, and with the walls being destroyed, and probably not completely, just all the walls were knocked down, there's gaping holes in the wall. You understand that the city is not fortified. The city then is, or has the possibility of being impenetrated or by others and other nations. And so it's at risk. And the story of Nehemiah goes, Nehemiah, the first thing he does is he's quietly there. He's sort of a, if you will, kind of working undercover, a spy at night. He goes out, he views the walls. He finds out that not only are the walls in bad shape, but people aren't practicing their faith. They're not worshiping God. The priesthood has been just destroyed in many ways. People are just simply put, they're just not getting up and doing anything. And so Nehemiah, after he spies out the land for a little while, he calls the people together and they come together and he tells them what he's seeing and what could be. And when Nehemiah calls the people together and tells them, they, with one cry, one voice, stand up and say, let us rise up and build. And then they rebuild the wall. 52 days, they rebuild the wall. And it's not as if it's an easy job. First of all, you imagine the handwork that had to go on, but also imagine the fact that there are others, Sanballat and Tobiah, that are sitting on the outside hollering insults, raising up, if you will, an army to come against Nehemiah and his crew. Nehemiah and those that were working on the wall are so assured that these men are going to come against them that they literally have, if you will, a trowel in one hand working the stone and a weapon in the other. They get the walls rebuilt. They rebuild them in 52 days, and they begin then to work on the folks that are inside the walls. Priesthood is reestablished. Worship is reintroduced. Spirituality begins to come back. Nehemiah has done a tremendous thing. He has worked tremendously among the children of Israel. In Nehemiah, the 13th chapter, Nehemiah is kind of recanting or retelling, if you will, the things that has gone on and some of the reforms. And I like the last couple of verses. Let's look in Nehemiah 13, verse 30. Thus I cleansed them from everything pagan. I also assigned duties to the priests and to the Levites, each to his service, and to bring the wood offering and the first fruits at appointed times. Remember me, O my God, for good. You see, he's basically saying, if you go back and read the whole chapter, my legacy is what I've done. Now, God, remember me for the good that I have done. When folks pass from this earth, we leave a legacy. Rich or poor, we leave a legacy. I don't know how many of you watch NCIS. I do. It's one of my favorite shows. That and Blue Bloods are probably my two favorite shows. Those are my two favorite. But I also do watch a couple of other shows that are not as favorites, but I do watch them. And then it's the other thing that's good on TV is called sports, because the rest of it's worth, watching. But anyway, NCIS has been on for a long, long time. And Mark Harmon used to be on it, and it's a very good show. I've always liked it because there's a sense of this team being really family community. Now, the Hawaii one's fine, and the others, the New Orleans that they took off the air was pretty good, but just the original NCIS. Well, there was a medical examiner who was very wise and very knowledgeable on the show. In real life, well, they had written him off the show a couple of years ago because he was getting old and he was also sick. Well, he died this past year, literally. You might remember. Do you remember the show Man from U.N.C.L.E.? Thank you. That was it. He was on it. Yeah. David McClellan, I believe, McCallum was his real name. Well, they had a show, NCIS had a show Tuesday night that was interesting because it was memorializing him in his passing. And they said something, they put a line in the storyline that he had supposedly said as, of course, the individual on the show. And it's kind of an interesting thing. I'm not sure. I'm still thinking it through, but it's still an interesting thought. And the statement was that we all die twice. Now, from a spiritual standpoint, we know that's not true. Well, it could be. You die when you die to sin, and then you die physically when we pass from this world. But his point was this. He said, we all die twice. When we die physically, and when the stories about us die, that's when we die. Well, that's an interesting thought. Like I say, there's things you go, no. But just think about that idea. That, in many ways, for many of us, is our legacy. My mom and dad died. There wasn't anything except a few bills, several bills that we had to take care of. There was nothing else. There was no house, no insurance, nothing. But as Carol and I get together, my sister and I get together, and we got together Tuesday night, and just our regular 6 weeks, 8 week, get together, and enjoyed time together. As we were to leave, and she said, "You guys, today would have been Dad's birthday." I said, "Yep, I do." We sat there and talked about Dad for a few minutes. Carol's two girls and my son remember Dad. They were younger. Ethan was 16, so that means so Andrea was 16, and Andrea would have been 20, or Jessica would have been 20. They remember Dad. But eventually those stories will pass away. Now, you may leave a legacy that is rich with financial things, not just your story, but you may leave a lot of money behind. That's good. Whoever you leave it to, that's your business, and whoever you leave it to will remember you. But how will the world remember you? What will the world think of you? That's your legacy. That's in your hands right now. When they pass by your casket, what are they going to say about you? Well, that was a good person. That was a good guy. Oh, that's a good woman. That's a good lady. Now we're going to say other things. For some of you, we may say, "Did you make sure they're dead?" Christy, we wouldn't say that about you at all. No. Y'all think that's not true. It is true. But think about your legacy. Think about the story that you're leaving. Nehemiah said, "Remember me, O God, for good." What's in your hand? Your legacy. What you leave behind. Like I say, it could be financially, it could be a lot of land, it could be a lot of homes, and all that's fine. I'm just saying, be sure that your legacy is something beyond the material. Something somebody like to say. Well, along that same line, and you might say, well, that's pretty much the same thing. And it is, but it's not. Have in your hand a good name. In Proverbs 22, verse 1. Proverbs 22, verse 1 says, "A good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, loving favor rather than silver and gold." Now, Solomon's equivalent of this in Ecclesiastes 11 says that a good name is rather to be had than great riches. But he also says the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. We're going to stick with Proverbs 22 this morning. Good name is to be chosen than great riches. You have within your hand today your reputation. You might say, well, that's my legacy. I got you. But legacy is pretty much kind of what you're going to leave behind. Your reputation is what's building your legacy. Now, you have that in your hand. And Solomon says, good name is chosen rather than great riches. A good name, good reputation. Good reputation. It's harder to imagine this because, number one, we're so spread out, and being in a community the size of Nashville, we can literally drive down the street, even of our own neighborhood, and not know our neighbors. And so that's just a reality. But imagine if you live in a town, let's say, of 5,000 people. Suzanne and I have lived in a few of those. And you're able to drive down the street and you know, because you've seen them out in the yard, you've walked past them, you've talked to them. It's just a little freer there in the smaller communities than it is somewhere like Nashville. But I often, used to, like when we lived in Waverly, I walked up and down the street and you'd see people out in the yards and you'd stop and talk to them about their yard, or stop and talk to them about their flowers, or you'd see them in the grocery store and they'd say, I know you. And you're going, huh? Because I don't know you. And they'd introduce themselves. Well, I live 4 doors down from you. I've seen you out in your yard. And then you talk. And then every time you see them at the grocery store, Walmart, conversation. Well, imagine, if you will, driving down one of those streets and being able, like I say, almost every house to know who they are, where they go to church, what they do for a living, and you've carried conversations with them. Now, ask yourself, if I lived in that kind of community and my neighbors, either on their way to town or to the doctor or to work or to wherever, drove past my house and they said, there lives Joe Blow, and you're Joe Blow, what would they say about you? They're nice people. He's a good guy. He's an honest guy. He's a funny guy. He's a friendly guy. He's the guy that always waves. My neighbors are getting sick of me being out in the front yard when they drive past me. Why? Because I wave at them if I'm in my right thinking. And I'm sure 90% of them don't wave back. I don't look to see. But I want them to realize when they pass that house, because you'd be surprised how many of them probably know whose house that is. We have to understand we're leaving behind a reputation, not just a legacy, but a reputation. So what is your reputation? You've got it within your hands. Something to think about. Something else. Does anybody have something else that they'd like to talk about with regards to I've got a list. I'm not finished, but does anybody have one that they'd like to talk about? Well, what's in your hands? Well, how about time? Since we're in Proverbs, let's just go back to Psalm chapter, the 90th Psalm, Psalm chapter 90, whatever you want to call it. Psalm 90 and verse 12. So teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. What do you do with your time? In your hand is your time. Now, time's valuable. The days of our years are 60 years, and if by reason of strength, 70 years. Remember, 70, and if by reason of strength, he said, we're soon cut off and they fly away. Lifespan is really not that long, is it? We don't know how long we're going to live. None of us. And I'm glad I don't know how long I'm going to live. I'm glad. Within your hand, within my hand, we have our time. How are we going to spend our time? Now, let's say this. Our time does not always have to be filled with work. Jesus did. Jesus went out from the multitudes and from the people that were even in his inner circle from time to time, and he would go out to pray or he would go out to meditate. He believed in taking care of himself as well. Very busy, but he believed in taking care of himself. In your scheduling of time, family is important, isn't it? Should be. Spending time with your family, spending time with those that you love. That's in your hand. Well, how else might you spend your time? Well, work. And work is not always, and I'm using this in a generic term, work does not always mean, a paid job. It can be. But you can also think about work from the standpoint, you got housework, right? You got the house you got to clean up, or the outside that you got to take care of. You got household work. And so part of your time is made up of work, whether it's a paid job or just the little chores that you do. And what else you got in your time? Well, got church time. I got shopping time because we got to buy groceries, and we got of course we got to eat. We got eating time. What else? Well, think about it. We all have our time budgeted differently to do different things. But Paul talked about, in Ephesians chapter 5, to redeem your time. And when we look at that, that just seems odd, because when we think of redeeming, we think of what? Salvation, right? But the word redeem there has the idea of making the most of your time, using your time wisely. What is a good use of time for you may not be a good use of time for me. I had a man that I used to talk to a lot. He has passed away since. But he enjoyed, and it was probably a good use of time. He was retired. He enjoyed sitting down in his living room and turning on the TV and watching the Nature Channel or the nature shows, Animal Kingdom and things like that, Marlin Perkins and all of that kind of stuff. He enjoyed that. His wife was a very much of a go-getter, I guess is probably, for lack of a better term. I mean, she just couldn't, bless her heart, she couldn't sit still. And there was always something to do around the house, whether it was clean up something, straighten up something, especially his messes, but cook a meal or cook something for somebody else, cookies, brownies, whatever. And he just didn't understand why she just wouldn't sit down beside him and watch those shows with him. And I tried to explain to him one day, she don't like doing it. I mean, I got to where I just got a little ugly with him. She don't like to do that. That's not fun for her. Why don't you get up and help her cook a pie for that shut-in that she's going to carry? Well, I don't like doing that. Well, all right, then what are we going to do? Well, I guess she can cook her pie. And I said, I guess you can watch her shows. There are times like that. But use your time. Use your time, whatever you do, to glorify God. If you stop and think about what you're here for, we're all here to glorify God. That's what you're here for. You and I are here to bring glory and honor to God. And when we put that purpose in our life, now, what you do with your life, build houses, build empires, build families, whatever. Use your time wisely. Well, we got others. Let me just give you this list. These are the things that are in your hand And so I just challenge you to take them and use them wisely. Your life is in your hands, and ultimately where you'll spend eternity is in your hands. Your influence, we've kind of in many ways already talked about that from the standpoint of legacy and reputation, but your influence. Will you bless or harm people? Think about this week. And I know this is an odd contrast, but think about this week. Think about this week. Think about the contrast between Jezebel and Jesus. Now there's a contrast for you. But think about that contrast and think about, okay, well, I'd rather be like Jesus. Good. Also within your hands, your tyrants and ultimately your soul, where you'll spend eternity. So take care of those things. Anything else? Any questions, comments, suggestions? Well, next week we'll do another question. This is the fourth or fifth one. We're going to do 13. We're going to eventually get into the New Testament and look at some questions there. But hopefully this is just giving you some food for thought. And we'll get back to the textual class here after we finish 13 weeks of questions. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Our kind and loving Heavenly Father, we're thankful for this day. We're thankful for the blessing of it. Thankful for the opportunity that we have to study your word. Thankful for what it means and what it is to us. May we always be mindful of the fact that there are so many things that you've really entrusted us with that are in our hands. And may we ever use them wisely. May we ever use them for your glory and for your good. We also are mindful of those that are hurting. We ask that you be with Miss Lily Huble's family, that you bless them and keep them as they're going through this difficult time. We also ask that you be with those that will be mentioned in a few minutes that are not feeling well, sick. We ask that you take care of them and bless them back to their much normal walks of life. We also ask that you be with Miss Ferguson that added her to our list, that the doctors will soon be able to find what's wrong with her and they'll be able to help her as well. We ask that you be with all of us, that we may ever live with you, that we may ever live near you, and that we may ever be the example that you would have us to be, so that we can let our light shine before others so that they can see you and you alone. We ask now that you watch over us and that you hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Y'all have a great week. Thank y'all.